So we had good morning. So for those of you that don't know, Michelle, if you want to say hi again, she's new to our brokerage. She just joined. She's in the process of going through it all. I think we've got everything all lined up paperwork wise. But do you want to just say hi to the group a little bit and maybe tell them sort of where you're working and what sort of areas you're looking after?
Sure. So I'm Michelle. Hi. I just came over this week, actually. It was a very quick transition for me. I am at the Lake Cowichan office and I live in Maple Bay. So I'll be focusing, sorry, a lot on that area and in Duncan probably, but I'll obviously look after here too. But yeah, if you have questions, I will answer anything.
Excellent. And so obviously your email has been added to our generation list and that kind of stuff. So yeah, anyway, welcome and thanks for coming on board. We're happy to have you.
Thank you.
So on the calendar, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about some residential tenancies, but there's been a lot of discussion lately on the 3-day rescission period and a couple of things that obviously that we're going to be really focused on coming up starting in the new year. So has anybody had a chance to take that 3-day rescission period course, the self-paced program?
I did. I don't think I took the course actually, but I was in the webinar or whatever it was that they had the first day.
Okay, good. So there is a PDP course. BCRA has put it out, and they go through step by step of really sort of what we can expect to see. The forms will all be updated, so we'll go through all of those a little bit closer and keep everything obviously as a little bit of a reminder. But has anybody had questions from clients, or has there been much discussion or inquiry from the public on that? Nothing doing, hey? Sorry, Ron?
No, nothing. Just I think there's been a lot of conversation amongst the realtors, but I don't imagine the public, for the most part, have really a clue or paying attention. So.
No, and the onus will be on us. So your disclosure of representation will have a section that talks about the right of rescission. Generally speaking, given the current market conditions and given the direction that we're going, I'm not too certain it's going to be have a huge impact on the contracts we're dealing with. We will just have to make sure that we deal with those disclosures properly. So as you all know and are aware, the disclosure of representation is to be provided prior to providing any real estate services. It's fairly common practice in the business to have that really sort of signed the date of the contract that you're writing, but it's arguable that you're providing services well before that. So I think I emphasize this a lot, and I know you all hear it from me. We want to be the bar and we want to elevate. So we really need to do a good job and perhaps just a better job of utilizing the tools and the forms that are available to us to highlight really the value that we have. And I know I've talked about this before, but when you have that initial conversation and you're talking about the form, most people will have never seen one, even though they're working with a realtor. And if you provide that up front, automatically you're showing better value to the clients up front. So Alex has just joined us here in the border. Good morning. Good morning. Yeah. Thanks for the air conditioning in the front there. It's well appreciated.
Long time of year, but we got something figured out for the summer now.
So real quick, is everybody fairly comfortable? Does anybody have any questions about the rescission period? Basically, we are probably going to be preparing most contracts with conditions, so it's not likely going to have much of an impact on our day-to-day practice. If you have an offer with conditions, and one of the biggest questions and queries about that is, oh well, if I find out I don't get financing, on day one, do I have to pay the penalty? And the answer is no. If you have an offer with conditions and you collapse that offer due to conditions, even within that 3-day period, you're not exercising the 3-day rescission period, right? You must deliver notice to exercise that right of rescission. So just to be clear, unless you use the notice to exercise it, there is no penalty payable. So you can collapse a deal with conditions. Andy?
From what I gather about our immediate new duties regarding the rescission period, I think the take home that I got was having to ensure that we correctly calculate the amount owing should they choose to do the rescission, as well as the correct date. I think those will be the two most key things in the short term.
Yeah.
Am I missing anything there?
No, the amount owing, so the contract of purchase and sale, page 1, below where you put the initial offer price and then below the deposit, there is a specific area there where you will be putting the amount of the rescission penalty if it is invoked. Now it is 0.25%. You know, again, you know, BCFSA has made us challenge our math skills when they came out with the disclosure remuneration to the seller. So this is just another little incident, but the contract purchase and sale will detail that. And every time there is a counter offer back and forth, that number, in addition to the price, will have to be changed. And they're very specific. And, you know, every change that is made in a contract must be initialed and validated by all parties in that contract. So we have to make sure when we're adjusting the price, we'll be adjusting the penalty amount and ensuring that we get the initials in the proper place. And the 3 days is 3 full business days. So if for example, you know, Andy, for example, you know, I send, we get an offer together on, you know, Monday morning, or say Monday at noon, that 3 full days doesn't start until Tuesday. So Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday would be the 3-day rescission period. It is 3 full business days. And of course, business days does not include statutory holidays. It does not include Sundays and all that other kind of stuff. So there is a list. If you have a chance and, you know, you have a few minutes, I encourage you to take the webinar. I've been working through it myself. Unfortunately, I haven't had tons of time to go through it in its entirety, but it does get very specific and very clear on how we need to calculate those days. And the number obviously is a fairly simple one. So
it'll be interesting to see if Really Trusted adds that to their platform of forms, you know, and automatically calculates it. That would be really awesome.
It would, and I'm not sure if they will, unfortunately, because it's going to be part of the contract of purchase and sale. So it's going to have to be something that we fill out when we're actually preparing the contract.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, it will be fully incorporated. I would expect that the notice form, so when you're invoking the right to rescind after 3 days or prior to 3 days, I expect we'll see that form in Really Trusted. But I'm not sure. We're not going to see the contract of purchase and sale in there. That's going to be something that we just have to manage on our own. Yeah, exactly, Brandy. Yeah, Alex.
The question I had was, with the deposit that the seller's entitled to getting, how do the funds get paid to them from the real estate brokerage?
So one, as a listing realtor, when we're negotiating, I think there's 2 parts to this. We as a brokerage are really going to want to advocate for enough of a deposit upfront to at least cover the penalty that's due and payable to the seller. Regardless of where the deposit is paid, the deposit can be paid to the buyer's brokerage, and I would suggest a minimum in the amount of the penalty on acceptance when we're negotiating contracts as far as listing realtors go. But once the notice of rescission is delivered within the correct time period, the deposit automatically is releasable, and the obligation is on the brokerage holding the deposit to pay that penalty amount to the seller.
So that's a good point. So we want to make sure that the deposit is substantial enough to be able to cover that, because we don't want to be chasing after clients for funds that we don't have.
That is correct. Yeah, we're not obligated as the listing broker to pay the penalty. The obligation to pay the penalty is on the buyer. So if you're working for a buyer, you need to obviously understand that and make sure your clients are aware of that. But when you're working for a seller, we need to make sure that we're negotiating contracts that are going to be protecting them and ensuring that their best interests are looked after.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, if you ever see a buyer putting in an offer and you're a listing agent and they're putting in deposit to be paid upon subject removal, that's a big flag now. You're going to want to protect your sellers by ensuring that at the very least you're getting it upon acceptance of the offer, right? Within that 3-day period.
Yeah, and it could be a tiered deposit structure too. You know, like for $1 million property, the penalty is $2,500. You know, so I would expect that the deposit's probably going to be in excess of that anyway. We're not we don't spend a lot of time negotiating $1 million contracts with $2,500 deposits. So, but even if it's if it is $1 million, for example, we will have $2,500 payable upon acceptance. And if it's a $50,000 deposit, then we're going to have an additional $47,500 payable upon removal of subjects. Ron, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I just wonder, I'm not muted, am I?
No, you're good.
Sorry, just wondered if there's been any provision or discussion from BCRA or BCFSA on the form of those funds, because typically, upon acceptance, the buyer's just going to write a check. Now, what if that check doesn't clear?
So yes, so there hasn't been any specific, there's nothing really that sort of details what or how a deposit is paid, except how we specify it in the contract. So oftentimes we will see in contracts of purchase and sale, deposits are paid via certified funds, bank draft, wire transfer, or that kind of thing. Personal checks, obviously, if a personal check is paid to a brokerage prior to that, being able to clear the account, that check has to clear the account prior to it coming out. So from a listing realtor perspective, we're probably going to look to have at least, part of that deposit, if not the full deposit, paid with certified funds. But nothing from BCFSA on how the deposit is paid. Or BCRA. Natalia and then Alex.
Yeah, I have a question because we don't have that, and I'm trying to understand, is this deposit refundable or non-refundable if the buyer changed their mind during those 2-3 days? Is it refundable to them or no?
No, if the buyer, and so that depends. If the buyer just changes their mind and says, I don't want to buy this house, then no, it's not refundable to them. If they exercise the right of rescission, that money is automatically payable to the seller. If the deal collapses due to a condition and they don't actually activate the notice of rescission, then yes, it is refundable to them, the buyer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that answers my question. Thank you.
Yeah.
The question is one question, one statement. So when we're dealing with a situation where we're talking about this particular resource that we can use, we're not talking about condition offers, we're talking about unconditional offers. So what you might see in an offer is $2,500 up front upon acceptance, but there is no subject removal to increase the deposit. So you might see, $2,500 upon acceptance, and after 5 business days, increase to $50,000 for the deposit. Because we're not I don't know how you'd structure that if you don't have conditions. There's no increase after subject removal. It's an acceptance already, right?
Yeah.
So that's just a thought there. The other thing is if your guy, this is more of a comment, but if you have clients that need to have conditions, this doesn't change the fact that we don't really want to recommend it. But if they're trying to be competitive in an offer situation, they're going up against an offer like this, then there's no reason why that your offer can't have a non-refundable deposit. Like, for example, Darren brings a condition-free offer. He's got his rescission period. He's now maxed out at $2,500 technically of what his deposit that he has to pay to the seller if it doesn't work out. But nothing stops us from saying, well, we have conditions, but we're willing to give you a $10,000 deposit, non-refundable with a week of conditions. And then the seller can evaluate, okay, I understand that this person's going in subject free, but if this deal doesn't work out, I'm only going to get $2,500 out of them. but maybe I should look at this offer with conditions because they're putting up 10 grand as a non-refundable deposit. Like we're allowed to offer that, not that we want to recommend it first and foremost, but if we're in a competitive offer situation and we don't have confidence to go in subject free, well then keep that into consideration that most likely if there's a condition free offer, the most that deposit's going to be is 2,500. I'm not saying it's always going to be that case, but that's just something to keep in mind about.
Yeah, maybe, but if we're dealing with condition-free offers and obviously with the home prices and stuff like that, like there's gonna be a deposit due and payable on acceptance, I would think. If I'm acting for a seller and I'm getting a subject-free offer, then that deposit is payable immediately. If you're sending me a subject-free offer, you're saying everything is good. You don't need financing, you don't need inspection, you don't need anything. So
Right,
pay
but
your
is it-
deposit and let's go.
But if you see it in the offer that their deposit is $2,500, then they're kind of rolling the dice a little bit. If they show you in the offer that they have the $50,000 up front,
Mhm.
then that's a bit more of a strength in the offer, right?
Well, the $2,500 would be the penalty,
Okay.
not the deposit. The
Okay.
deposit and the penalty amount are two different topics.
So they could write in $100,000 deposit, but at the end of the day, what's on the table is $2,500.
Yeah,
Wow.
if they rescind. But if that rescission period goes, or, you know, if somebody puts in a condition-free offer and that rescission period expires, then that 100,000 is at risk. If they decide down the road,
Exactly.
or, you know, we have seen, you know, a challenging situation, and it's something that, you know, we have to be very delicate with when we're dealing with condition-free offers, and then we're anticipating that the buyer needs financing and they can't get it. We have to be very careful about preparing those contracts. We've seen a lot of that in the competitive market, and you know, we're still currently within the brokerage, we're dealing with a few situations where a buyer hasn't been able to complete because they actually needed financing and they were unable to get it.
Right.
So it's a challenging situation, and of course, from a buyer's perspective, you know, the deposit they paid is completely at risk.
Is this rescission period take place after somebody removes subjects as well?
No, on acceptance.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
And so we've actually had a bit of discussion too about the actual acceptance date. The new contract for purchase and sale on the signing page, the last page where the parties sign under seal, there is a specific section added below those comments identifying what the specific final acceptance of that contract is, and that will be the date that we utilize it. The current one that we have right above the signatures, typically, and not typically, but often will get filled out on a counter offer or back and forth, and it will really cloud when the actual final acceptance is. So that has been specified in the new release of the CPS that will be in effect January 3rd. Has anybody had a chance to review the forms at all? There is a preliminary release. I know I sent a link out to everybody a couple of weeks back with what the new forms were going to look like. I would really encourage you to try and familiarize yourself with them. They are going to be, we're only about, oh my goodness, 3 weeks away from 2023. So this stuff is coming up pretty quick. And it would serve us all well if we were very familiar with this information. We were familiar with the forms because our clients are going to be asking about it and we have to present it to them. So the better we do at preparing ourselves, the more value we're going to provide to our clients, and the better you're going to look over your competition. Any other comments on that? I'll touch base again. So January 3rd or January 1st, the foreign buyer ban. So non-residents, non-Canadian citizens will be banned for a period of 2 years, and there's nothing really, there's no way around this. There's not a whole lot of specific information. This came up at our board meeting at BCRA yesterday. The federal government has not provided any really sort of specific detail or clarity. It's possible that the implication of this or the timeline of this may get bumped a little bit, because they really haven't given some specific information around the legislation, other than if you're not a Canadian citizen or you're not a permanent resident, you can't buy property in Canada. Jen?
If we have an accepted offer before the 31st of December, how is that going to work? It's funny, I actually just had a client reach out about my condo listing from the States this morning.
The contract date. So the date of the contract purchase and sale, the date that the contract is accepted, the date you
Okay.
have an enforceable contract. So maybe not the date on the page 1, but the acceptance date.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, that must be prior to January 1st. And even still, highly recommend, your clients having a bit of a discussion with their lawyer. Make sure they get some good legal advice. Okay, that's what I have just as far as those. Now we've got a bit of time. Does anybody, Jen, how's your week been? Like, what are you seeing up in the valley there?
I've had a few buyers surface this week, which is really good. But still feel like a hamster in a wheel, just going around doing nothing.
I think, we talk about it a lot, and that's just staying relevant and staying visible and making sure that you're in front of all your potential customers and clients. And so it's not uncommon to be, a little bit slower this time of year. Which is a really good opportunity to make sure that we're caught up on any education that's required as far as mandatory PDP, any sort of licensing education, and again, even the relevant legislation changes and stuff like that coming up. Always expect to have to sort of shift and adjust in what we're looking, what we're doing now as far as learning, new regulation and new rules is going to be something that we're going to continually have to do. Blair Morrison, the CEO for the BC Financial Services Authority, was a guest at our meeting yesterday. And though there was nothing specific, he was clear that the mandate from the government obviously is consumer protection. And as much as we love or hate the fact that regulations are going to be changing, they will continue to. And so we just have to understand what our role is, and from a professional level, we need to make sure that we are fully informed and we understand what's going on so we can convey that information to our clients. Jack, you have a question?
I do, yes. Hi, Michelle, welcome to the group. First off, nice to meet you. Darren, I'll keep it long story short. I've got a listing that's tenanted upstairs and downstairs. As a listing agent, when is my duty to get in contact with these tenants and start verbiage in terms of showings? Is that something I want to do right away? Or can you explain to me a little bit about that? Because I've been in touch with the property manager. The tenant upstairs is fantastic, but I've made inroads with the tenant below today, and it seems like he's a bit prickly.
Yeah.
So I'm just waiting to hear back from him. But what if he refuses showings and says, you cannot come into my suite? So can you just touch a little bit on that?
Yeah, good. And that was actually something that I wanted to talk about initially with our topic for this week. And so we'll move into that. But best practice, and whenever I was dealing with a tenant occupied property, I'm always making contact with the tenant in advance of the house actually being marketed. You're trying to establish a relationship with that tenant that is going to be as cooperative as possible. The same way you're building a relationship with your actual client, you need to have a good relationship with that tenant. Now, you may not like them. They may be a pain in the ass, pardon my language, but there has to be an attempt to maintain some sort of cooperation level. Usually, often it will go relatively smoothly, but there is a lot of fear in tenants, especially some that have a particular property that's leased sort of undervalue and a really good situation. Fear can cause a lot of anger and a lot of frustration. How you deal with that really depends on the structure of the tenancy. If there's a property management company, you may need to actually get them involved to have a conversation with that tenant. The tenants are technically unrepresented. The property manager does represent the owner of the property. The tenant may want to, you may want to have a conversation about what their obligations are, but also what their rights are. And tenants often know what their rights are, especially if they're sticky tenants. Sometimes they forget what their obligations are. So having a really genuine, balanced conversation about rights, explaining what their rights are and what they can expect, trying to manage, a schedule around showings, like are there some pre-set times and dates throughout the week or the weekend that we can set up a schedule for accessibility. The hard part about that too sometimes is if they are uncooperative, the hard conversation is telling them that whether you like it or not, there may be a time where we're just coming and you don't actually get to say yes or no.
Well, that's what's happened, Darren, is I'll just be very transparent here. I've had a really good communication with lady upstairs. The scheduling's been great with her. We're on a text every day conversation, but I haven't spoke to the tenant downstairs because he was away on a trip.
Yeah.
So he comes back this weekend and I've texted him this morning. Obviously I should have gotten in contact with him sooner, but the property manager cut a key for me. She said, Jackie, you're happy to show this as much as you want. He comes back December 11th. Let's touch base then. So maybe I should have reached out to him a little sooner, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Anytime there is a tenant in a property, you really want to reach out to them prior to it being listed for sale. They may not be aware of it. They may not have been informed. It might be a surprise to them. There's all sorts of circumstances, and really we don't know where they are or what their headspace is. So figuring out what that is and trying to build on that relationship in advance will definitely do us well. But ultimately, if they're uncooperative, it's a tough conversation. But if you're gonna refuse to allow showings or refuse to cooperate with scheduling showings, we're just gonna post notice and we're gonna come whether you like it or not. So I will also say that as the listing realtor, if you're posting notices for showing and the tenant is uncooperative, you as the listing realtor have an obligation under the Residential Tenancy Act to be present for all showings. And that is specifically for ensuring the safety and security of the tenant's belongings. You cannot send another realtor with their client, in particular, if you don't have cooperation. If you have cooperation and the tenants are like, yeah, that's fine, they can come, that's great. But if you're uncooperative, we're in breach of the Residential Tenancy Act if the listing realtor or the seller are not present when a property is being shown. So be mindful of tenant occupied properties and obviously, what those challenges can be. That was actually something that was brought to my attention with a dispute hearing that we went through a little while ago. It was very deep in the regulations. I wasn't 100% clear on it. So I just want to make sure that as a listing realtor, definitely keep that in consideration when you have a tenant occupied property. Ron, you have a comment or a question?
Yeah, just a couple things. First off, Jack, I assume the property manager gave that downstairs tenant the proper notice, or you posted a notice or something that you would be accessing the property, because just because the tenant's known that he's going to be away doesn't give you the right to enter without notice. Second to that, Darren's comment about engaging with the tenant and trying to have some kind of a cooperative agreement in place is really key when you're trying to push your way in. Although the act says we can just give notice, we can go ahead. If they're standing at the door and saying you're not coming in, you're not coming in. You're not pushing your way in. You then have to go through the process and channels to gain access. Get an order for possession and so on and so forth, which can literally take months and thousands of dollars. So you can't physically force your way in if the tenant is saying, no, don't come in. I had a couple other thoughts, but that was the key on that.
Yeah, further to that, Ron, the spectrum of how that, relationship and how that sale process is going to play out is really wide. It can be smooth, it can be easy, you could have no challenges, and you can be 100% cooperative, or you could really have somebody that's digging in their heels and being absolutely, adamant that they're not there, or, potentially they are there, and oftentimes tenants will sort of disparage the property when you're, showing potential buyers and that kind of stuff. So the establishment of that relationship and really just sort of, clearly, it's setting the tone, and it's setting the ground rules, and making sure, as I said, make sure they understand their rights and direct them to the residential tenancy branch and stuff like that, but also make sure they understand their obligations. And that's a bit of a tough one. Often I will start that conversation with their obligations and then soften it with what their rights are, and making sure that they have direction to people they can contact or resources that are available to them as tenants. Did I see a question somewhere? Sorry, there's a chat that I missed.
I'll just add on the thought of, trying to establish some kind of a cooperative relationship, communicating with the tenant up front. Absolutely bang on that you need to have a conversation with them and give them some comfort if you can. Particularly people who have been there for a while and they've got a below market rent and they're worried about getting tossed out and not being able to afford to live somewhere. You got to be empathetic to that, but explain to them their rights, and that the only way they're going to be asked to move is if somebody's intending to occupy the property themselves. So with a basement suite kind of situation, most of the time when those properties change hands, the tenant gets to stay. It's not usually another family member moving into or occupying the whole house. So chances are, if they're a good tenant, then a new owner will want to keep them. It'll be part of getting the property sold. The upstairs tenant could be a bigger problem. So good, Jack, that this one's cooperative. I also, so many situations I've seen agents and homeowners reward their tenants. Don't do it with a bribe before they've demonstrated good behavior and cooperation. If you're going to do it at all, do it as a reward for good behavior after it's actually happened. So that might look like some further rebate on the rent or something after everything's done, but don't give them a discount on their rent during the process to try and elicit good behavior.
Would it be the listings agent to tell the tenants that they're going to be leaving? Would that be my job if that is the case?
Well, it's technically it's the seller's responsibility, but if you're acting as the agent for the seller, then you're probably going to get that job.
Awesome.
Yeah, well, and I mean that, if it is managed by a property management company, that notice can be delivered by the property management company. But ultimately, if the buyer is requesting vacant possession and you're required to give notice, one specifically that the term, the request for the seller or the seller's agent to deliver notice to vacate must be in the contract. If there is not a term in the contract that says, the seller will give notice upon receipt from the buyers, more or less, then the seller does not have to. So, if you're working with a buyer, you want to make sure that your contract allows you to do that, because if it's not in the contract, the seller is not obligated to give that notice, and then a buyer would not be able to serve notice to that tenant until they took possession of the property. Andy, how much notice is required to show the suite? Full business days or any day of the week? So that depends. The easiest is 24 hours, and 24 hours is basically, once around the clock, and that is with notice delivered specifically in hand or communicated directly. You need to ensure that that notice is basically delivered in hand. Ways to communicate need to be established, and this should be part of the conversation with the tenant up front. How they choose to communicate can really impact how this is going to go. If they do not agree to text or email or phone calls, everything must be in writing. So you need to be very specific about that, because that is per the Residential Tenancy Act, and notices through email, text, or whatever the electronic means is, may not be legal notice unless they specifically agree to communicate that way. So always keep in mind that it should be in writing, and part of your interview and your initial consultation with the tenant is agreeing in writing. So here's an email that says, thank you for taking time to meet. Here's a link to the Residential Tenancy Act as promised in our discussion, confirming that we're okay to communicate by email, by text as we discussed. Please let me know if there's anything else, and get a response. So you have something in writing that clarifies how you can communicate, because if they agree to communicate via text or email, then that will be fine. Challenged situations, I would not accept that. Notice would be posted or hand delivered. So again, Andy, sorry, I'm getting a little off traffic. A notice delivered is 24 hours. If you must post notice on the door, it is a 3-day notice. It's a 72-hour notice. However, it is 24 hours. Sorry, it's 3 days before that notice is deemed received, and then the 24-hour notice kicks in. So it's a 72-hour notice, but it's actually a 24-hour notice. If you post it on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, 3 days, after those 3 days, on Thursday, the notice will be deemed to receive. Once that is deemed to receive, or deemed to be received, then the 24 hours kicks in. So if you post notice on Monday, you go Friday. That's the legal requirement, even though there is definitely a lot of uncertainty around that 3 days. But if you're posting notice, it's 24 hours, 3 days deemed received. It's actually 96 hours before you can legally enter the property.
96 hours?
4 days, yeah.
How do you do that on touch base?
That's the worst case
Yes.
scenario, right? Like, that's the uncooperative tenant who's refusing to return calls, who's refusing access and that kind of stuff. So that's the worst case scenario.
There is, and if you guys get into that situation, there is a rule that you can post up to 15 showings in a month in advance. So if you're dealing with somebody you know is gonna be a headache, then predetermine the times now that you want access, put that on the door, 72 hours is, or whatever, 4 days deemed received. Then after that 4 days, you've already got these predefined times. You're not just posting notice each time. You've already got your up to 15 times in a month.
Yeah.
15 times in a month, already predefined set times. That's how you strike back as a realtor if you're dealing with a bad tenant.
So, well, sort of, you need, so with that notice, one, you have to be there.
Yeah.
But two, you also have to tell them who's coming, how long they're going to be there, and what the purpose of it is. So it can't just be pre-setting blank appointments, hoping to slot somebody in. You actually have to have an appointment. You have to tell them who is coming.
Well, you have to give a 2-hour time frame.
Yeah.
I don't think.
Or you could pull an Alex and just drive right into their house.
Oh, too soon, too soon.
Listen,
Sorry, Alex, I had to.
whatever, you guys can do whatever you want. I actually think I found the cause of the issue, but no one cares, so whatever.
Is it work?
We
Well,
love you.
before,
Alex.
number
We
one,
love
but
you.
no, I looked at the setting today and it said that it had, it was an adaptive cruise control setting, and I think the cruise control hit without even being engaged. So we're looking into it, but
Sorry about that.
yeah. it's-
Dangerous.
You mean on the steering wheel
What's that?
accident?
What?
Don't buy a Ford.
What do you guys, thanks for all your.
You sure it
support.
wasn't parked?
Yeah, I still don't have a car.
Do you need a car?
I'll get a rental, but yeah.
You can borrow my Jeep for a couple of days.
Oh, no.
I got Christie's car. So.
Okay.
So I guess that would also relate to open houses as well, wouldn't it? You know, giving
Yes.
that notice. Oh.
Yeah. Honestly, you know, every effort that you put in up front to establish a good working relationship will benefit you. And, you know, we talk about, you know, these worst case scenarios, and they can sound, you know, daunting, and they can sound challenging and stuff. Generally speaking, you know, you will have pretty good relationships. And I think the key really is having some empathy and understanding, that these tenants are really at risk of losing their home. And for a lot of people, that's a really scary situation, especially if there are kids involved. They're well established, they've been there for a long time. So really understanding their situation and being empathetic will go a long way. And if you send them a $5 gift card to go for coffee, for example, when showings are occurring, that kind of stuff, like that's not a terrible idea either. It shows a little bit of compassion. It gives them a little something to do. Yes, they have to leave the house. They don't have to, but if they're going to leave, go for a coffee on me. Thank you very much for allowing us to show the property. Anybody have any crazy tenant stories?
Yeah.
I have one where the tenant absolutely refused to leave, and it was a very bold buyer that basically, so that the property had the transaction had closed. The tenant was provided notice to vacate. The tenant did not vacate. The buyer had two options. They could apply for an order of possession, which means they would wait for the order of possession to be granted. Then it would go to a bailiff. The buyer was potentially on the hook for several thousands of dollars to have a bailiff come in and remove the buyer. Buyer actually went into the house and moved the tenant's stuff out on the lawn and said, "You can pick it up anytime." It was a pretty tense situation. Again, once one in a million, I would think, but the potential for stuff like that is relevant. You have a story?
Yeah, well, no, and maybe I need to look into it further, but I had a very difficult tenant situation, and they were not cooperating with the schedule, because that's the first option, right? Is to work out what their schedule is like, and then once you can agree on that, then you can still offer them 24 overnight notice, but it's around their schedule, and make that their idea. And so this particular person didn't have any interest in helping, had tons of excuses. And so I did the route of posting on the door 15 showing blocks. I didn't say who was coming, I just said there were showings happening. And we would just use that time window to bring people through, and I had to be there for every one of them. And if there wasn't a situation that somebody wasn't coming, then I would just advise them that the appointment was canceled. But the point is, they on closing day, they didn't want to move out, and it took a situation like you mentioned, which was like the buyer just pretty much stared at them the whole time and said, "This is my house, I just bought it, get out of my house."
Yeah.
We gave them proper notice, and we followed the rules, and they weren't cooperating. Most of the time, it's all good, but you always hear about the bad stories, and I think that open communication of scheduling with them around their life, around their family, and then you negotiate maybe a weekend time from 2 to 4 and have an open house window. You can save a lot of grief if it's their idea. And then things like bringing gift cards and little thank you appreciation gifts just for their inconvenience also goes a long way. I've personally picked up clients. I know that Jack in this situation's made a relationship with the tenant upstairs, and now she's looking at buying a property. So if you treat them really well, there's no reason why they can't be a client in the future if they're looking at buying a property. So everything is an opportunity. Treat people with love and respect, and usually you don't run into the bad situations.
Yeah. And now that we've talked a little bit about listing, actual contracts of purchase and sale on tenant occupied properties, are sort of the other half of this discussion. And depending on who you're working for, or regardless of who you're working for, we want to make sure that, our clients are protected. It's our job to write proper, tight binding contracts, and we need to understand how we structure those contracts for their best interest. If we're a buyer agent, for example, and, we're putting an offer in on a tenant occupied property, and we know it's been a challenge the entire time, our buyer doesn't want the tenant. So structuring an offer in a way that allows for a little bit of a gap in case something goes sideways. Usually panic situations happen at closing because the deal's closing on the 31st. For example, the tenant's supposed to be out on the 31st, however, they're not. So, from a seller's perspective, the seller's in breach of contract because they're required to provide vacant possession as per the contract. It's a challenging situation for a buyer. However, if the seller can't provide vacant possession, then there is a breach and there is a contractual remedy that might be available to a buyer. They can postpone closing, they can, negotiate some sort of, amendment to the contract. So the seller would be contractually liable. So when looking at those types of situations, having a 2-week holdover or a 1-week holdover, for example, if notice is for the tenant to be out on the last day of the month, maybe consider having possession and completion 10 days after that. There's a 10-day period or a 2-week period where if they're having trouble getting the tenant out and the tenant refuses to leave, there's a window to work through some sort of remedy without exposing your buyer to a property with a tenant they don't want and without having a seller being in breach of contract. Is that clear? Does everybody understand that? If you have a buyer and a challenged tenant, have the contract state that notice will be served and vacant and the tenancy will end on X date. Have completion and possession 10 days, 15 days, or even a month later. If it's a really challenging situation, write it for a month. But, have that conversation with the seller saying, look, this is what we're doing. We're just a little bit concerned. If the tenant's gone, we're happy to move the dates up and close sooner. Most everybody will be that way, and a seller dealing with a challenged tenant will probably understand a buyer's perspective in that position. So
that's a good point. I actually never thought of that. So what you're saying is typically like what I've done is I always reference the notice right around when the buyer's moving into the property 60 days after or whatever we mutually agree to. But you're saying have a couple week buffer in case something goes sideways.
Yeah. If the tenancy, so I mean we're in December now, so if the tenancy is ending on December 31st, I'm having completion and possession probably around the 15th of January. And if the tenant goes and there's no issue, happy to move that up, obviously provided the lawyers have the ability to get that completion done. But make sure you have a buffer in there so that you're not putting your clients at risk of a breach of contract.
Or a difficulty moving in.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, a buyer doesn't have to complete if the seller says it's going to be vacant and it's not vacant. Whoa. The seller's in breach of contract.
Right. Yeah. Wow.
Is that a condition or a term?
Well, it's structured around so which the completion date.
Well, if they don't get vacant possession and then the buyer says, I'm backing out, I don't want it if it's not vacant.
So in a breach of contract, and obviously this is the point where they're getting the correct advice from their lawyer, but a buyer can walk if a seller breaches a contract
without fear of being sued.
Well, I mean, there would be a release because you're going to have to deal with deposits and that kind of stuff. So, I mean, if a seller is breaching, and there's a million ways and probably 1,000 ways a lawyer could argue this situation, depending on the intent. The seller could sue the tenant for damages, but I don't know if they're going to be able to sue the buyer. But if you're in breach of contract, you can walk. Like if your deposit is late by a day, from a buyer's perspective, your buyer's in breach of contract and the seller does have the option of canceling that contract. A breach has potential risks, and that's why it's really important that when we're structuring these contracts, we know what the dates are, we know what the obligations are, and we know what the deadlines are. It's really, really, really important.
So I understand the buffer that you're speaking of in regards to protecting your buyer to ensure that the place is in fact free of the tenant. And you suggested 2 weeks, maybe even a month. But from what I understand is if you really have to go the route of, getting a sheriff in there and all that, it could take months, right? So, I mean, does that sound early?
you know, when you get to that point, and that's protecting your seller too. You know, you don't want your seller to have a contract that says, you know, we're going to provide you vacant possession, but not provide them vacant possession. It really is, and this is only going to be with really challenging tenants, and you're going to know that right off the bat. You're going to know if you're dealing with challenging tenants. But if the tenant's not gone when they're supposed to be gone, you know, and you have closing 30 days from now, yes, that's a challenge, but you know, at least there's an opportunity where the buyer and seller can sort of have a discussion about what that looks like. You know, there can be an amendment to completion. Who knows? But it gives you an opportunity to negotiate that contract in advance of somebody being in breach of that contract. Is that clear, Andy? Sort of.
Yeah.
You know what? We're talking about some of these situations, and they are extreme, but you know they do happen. And really, you're not expected to have, you know, all of the answers, but you know, understanding that there are resources and there are supports for these types of situations is really, really important. And you will come across them at some point. And you know, often in the moment, you may have a thought or you're unsure, but just make sure if you find yourselves in these situations that you reach out and you get some really good guidance and assistance if you need it. Don't try to navigate on your own if you're unsure.
Like I mean, the nightmare situation that I could think of in my head would be, you know, like this tenant that's just not wanting to get out, and you have a whole family coming in, you know, with their moving truck, and they can't take possession because these idiots aren't getting out of the place. And you know, what do? I mean,
yeah.
What do they do?
So I mean, one, you know, we have that holdover, or we've structured the offer to have that holdover. We have some time to figure that out. What we do, we don't know. You know, every situation is a little bit different, and how that plays out really is just gonna sort of be in the moment. There's no you know, magic answer to all this. It's really how we approach it and how we navigate it. Like everyone can be a little bit different.
I mean, if I knew that this was a real potential to happen, I mean, the whole holdover would have to be substantial enough to basically put all of their stuff in storage for up to 2 months and give them enough money to have shelter, maybe at a Airbnb house for another couple months until the sheriff can get in there. Like, I mean, it would have to be quite substantial to hold back. Yeah,
potentially. Yeah, maybe from a seller's perspective, you try to renegotiate the contract to have the buyer take on the tenant if you're representing the seller. Natalia, and then Jack.
Do not you use the notice of rental contract termination? Okay, we do use it here. I don't know if you do, don't. It's a condition of the offer. When the buyer writing the offer to the seller, there is a condition that the seller will go to the tenant and sign the notice of lease termination. Okay, when it's signed by the tenant, it's much easier to exercise whatever you need to exercise, and it will be shorter. You don't do that?
In British Columbia, the Residential Tenancy Act is very, very different, I think, than what you're experiencing in Quebec. There is a notice to end tenancy, but basically it's a request. There is no obligation for a buyer to sign it. And if you're serving notice to end the tenancy, there is really only one reasonable method to utilize that notice, and that is for specific possession, for owner use. The balance of those reasons, such as a substantial renovation, the guidelines about that type of notice to end are so far beyond reasonable that it's just not even practical to consider. But it's a very difficult situation here in British Columbia. The tenants really will only go if they want to, and otherwise it's a lengthy battle, Natalia.
Well, this is the same pretty much the same here. Whatever you said about renovation, you allowed to repossess the dwelling only for yourself if you're planning to live there. However, okay, however, the way around we still put it in a contract, okay? We still try to make seller go to a tenant and try to see if they could peacefully sign this document. If it works, it's fine. If it doesn't, we understand.
No, there's always an option to try and mutually agree to end tenancy, but you know, in challenging situations, a tenant just probably won't sign it. Jack?
Yeah, I just wanted to fill in. I just got the call from the tenant downstairs. It went really, really well. He's actually an American. He's not back till January 6th, but conversation just led and he wants me to start looking for a house for him to buy. So it was like the perfect phone call. He's just dropping all this information, blah, blah. So I got his email and I'm going to look at some properties for him later and send them to him. But yeah, I was just grateful to have that call and get that out of the way. And he's happy for me to show the suite whenever is good for me. So pretty thrilled with that.
Awesome, good stuff.
Did you say he was an American?
Yeah, so we got 28 days or 23 days.
Okay, does anybody have anything further? It is 10 o'clock, so unless there's some questions or some afterthoughts, I know we've all got a little bit of work to do. I know I do, and I'm sure many of you do also, maintaining your businesses and so on. So unless there's anything further, we'll wrap this one up. If you guys have any afterthought or any comments or questions at all, please feel free to reach out. I always do my best to try and answer and respond as quickly as possible. You know, phone calls are usually the quickest. You don't have to text me to see if you can call. I know a lot of you love to text me and ask if it's okay to call. Just call. You can shoot me a text or email and stuff like that, but obviously, you know, my door's open and my phone's on, so don't ever hesitate to reach out if you have questions.
Thanks, Darren.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate you coming, as always.
Thank you, Darren.
Have a good day, guys.
Take care, guys.
Bye, everyone.